Every 80s kid remembers the exact sound of a screen door slamming shut right after breakfast and not coming back inside again until the streetlights flickered on at dusk. Nobody sat down and planned it that way. There was no parenting book that said, leave them alone for 8 hours. It just became the default, quietly, almost invisibly, because of the way the culture and the economy were shifting underneath everyone's feet. Parents were working longer hours than the generation before them. Divorce rates were climbing fast, reshaping millions of households into single-income, single-parent situations almost overnight. And somewhere in the middle of all that upheaval, an entire generation of kids learned, without anyone explicitly teaching them, that they were mostly on their own. So they rode bikes without helmets, down streets, with no adult supervision at all. They disappeared into the woods, into empty lots, into neighborhoods for hours at a stretch. They showed up at a friend's front door unannounced, because there was no way to call ahead, no cell phones, often no working home phone anyone bothered to answer. They called it a normal childhood, freedom, character building, the stuff nostalgic movies are made of. But today, when we look at it with modern language and modern understanding of child development, parts of it look less like freedom and more like something closer to structural neglect. Not cruelty, not malice, just a systemic gap in attention that nobody was tracking at the time. The first habit worth examining closely is that constant, unsupervised outdoor time. And on the surface, it genuinely does sound healthy. Fresh air, physical activity, problem solving without an adult hovering to fix every disagreement. But underneath that healthy surface was something else entirely. A near total absence of adult guidance during precisely the hours when kids most needed it. No one was tracking where you actually were. No one was checking in on how your day had really gone, what you were feeling, who you were fighting with, what scared you. As long as you turned up before dark with no visible injuries, you were considered raised right. Full stop. No further questions asked. The long-term effect of that shows up decades later as a strange, almost paradoxical trait. Adults who are fiercely, sometimes stubbornly self-reliant, who pride themselves on never asking for help, but who secretly never actually learned how to ask. Because for most of their formative years, help simply wasn't offered, and asking for it wasn't modeled by anyone around them. The second defining habit was the latchkey routine. Kids coming home to a completely empty house every single day immediately after school let out. Letting yourself in with a key hung on a string around your neck. Making your own snack or your own dinner because nobody else was coming home for hours. Watching hours of unsupervised television. Absorbing whatever was on because it was the only reliable babysitter in the house. It wasn't cruelty on the part of the parents. It was economics, plain and simple. 2 working parents becoming the norm. Affordable childcare barely existing. And a broader culture that simply hadn't caught up yet to what that daily solitude might actually cost a child psychologically. But that repeated daily aloneness taught something quiet and lasting. Emotions were something you processed by yourself, in silence, in an empty living room, because there was never anyone physically present to help you work through whatever had happened that day. The third habit, and one of the most controversial in hindsight, was physical punishment as the default parenting tool. Spankings, belts. The infamous dread-inducing threat of, just wait till your father gets home. At the time, none of this was considered controversial in the slightest. It was simply how discipline worked in nearly every household, across nearly every neighborhood, regardless of income or background. But decades of research since then have made something increasingly clear. Physical punishment doesn't just correct a specific behavior in the moment. It teaches something much deeper and far more lasting, that love and physical pain can originate from the very same source, and that authority figures are something to be feared rather than trusted or turned to. Decades later, that lesson resurfaces in adulthood in complicated ways. People who struggle badly with authority figures of any kind, who either overcorrect dramatically by becoming extremely permissive parents themselves, or who, without even realizing it, unconsciously repeat the exact patterns they swore as children they would never use on their own kids. The fourth habit was a pervasive culture of emotional stoicism. Rub some dirt on it. Stop crying, or I'll give you something to actually cry about. Kids these days are just too sensitive. Feelings in this environment weren't discussed, examined, or validated. They were managed, suppressed, redirected, or simply ignored until they eventually, inevitably went away on their own, or didn't. This atmosphere created a generation remarkably fluent in sarcasm, deflection, and self-deprecating humor as primary emotional coping tools, but often deeply disconnected from their own actual internal state. Ask an 80s kid, now well into their 40s or 50s, how they're really doing underneath the surface. And the honest answer is frequently some version of, honestly, I don't actually know. That's not coldness, and it's not a character flaw. That's simply a skill, emotional literacy, that was never modeled, never taught, and never given room to develop. The fifth defining habit was growing up entirely immersed in a constant, low-grade background fear. Nuclear war drills conducted matter-of-factly at school. The AIDS crisis dominating nightly news headlines with terrifying, often poorly explained urgency. Stranger danger campaigns so aggressive they made virtually every unfamiliar adult feel like a potential threat. None of these fears were entirely irrational. They were grounded in real headlines, real global tension, real public health crises. But living inside that atmosphere every single day, for years, without any adult around to explain or properly contextualize any of it, created a baseline of anxiety that never really had a functioning off switch. Many 80s kids grew into adults, carrying a persistent background sense that something bad could happen at literally any moment, even in situations where, logically and rationally, absolutely everything is fine. And here's where the full picture gets genuinely interesting. None of these 5 habits, examined entirely on their own, look anything like trauma. Unsupervised outdoor play, that's simply character building. Coming home alone every day, that's just responsibility, taught early. Physical discipline, that was just how things were reasonably done at the time. Suppressing emotions instead of expressing them, that was simply being tough. Living with constant background fear, that was just the news of the era. But nobody ever added all 5 of these together. Nobody stopped to look at a single child experiencing every one of these things simultaneously, day after day, year after year, and seriously asked what that specific combination might actually produce over time. It was never one single dramatic, headline-worthy bad moment. It was 1,000 small, seemingly unremarkable ones, quietly stacking on top of each other, year after year, until they formed something much larger than any individual piece. And that stacking effect leads directly to the real irony sitting underneath this entire story. The generation raised with essentially zero active supervision grew up to become, statistically, the most protective group of parents in American history. Baby monitors in every nursery. Real-time location sharing apps on every teenager's phone. Carefully scheduled, heavily supervised playdates replacing the old, simple instruction of go outside and be back by dark. That dramatic overcorrection isn't random, and it isn't accidental. It's a direct, deliberate response to lived experience. They know firsthand, in their own bodies and memories, exactly what it felt like to be genuinely unseen for hours or days at a time, and they made an active, conscious effort to ensure their own children never had to feel that same specific silence. The honest truth is that no single 80s childhood habit was ever designed intentionally to cause lasting harm. Each one made perfect sense at the time, given the surrounding culture, the economic pressures of the era, and the limited psychological information available to parents back then. But taken together, stacked one on top of another, day after day, for an entire childhood, they quietly shaped a generation that's remarkably skilled at surviving hardship on their own, but often visibly uncomfortable, simply asking anyone for support when they genuinely need it. And that's precisely why so many people from that era, when they look back honestly on their own upbringing, tend to say the exact same thing. I had a totally normal childhood. What they don't always say next, what often takes years, even decades, to fully recognize, is that normal and healthy were never actually the same thing. And confusing the two came at a real, if invisible, cost. They learned very early and very thoroughly how to handle absolutely everything entirely on their own. And now, as adults looking back with clearer eyes, some of them are only just beginning to realize something quietly profound: they never actually had to.